Good morning and welcome to the September 9th meeting of the Oregon Education Investment Board Best Practices and Student Transition Subcommittee. We'll begin with roll call. Seth?
Yvonne Curtis.
Here.
Mark Mulvihill.
Here.
David Reeves.
Here.
Lynn Saxton.
Here.
Kay Duran. Kim Williams.
All right, we do have a quorum and we're ready to go. So the first thing I'm going to look for is an approval of the agenda.
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the agenda for today. Anybody who's opposed? Okay, we'll move forward. Now I'm looking for approval of the meeting notes from August 25th.
Move for approval of minutes.
Second.
Been moved and second. Anybody opposed? Okay, we'll accept those meeting notes of August 25th. So now I'd like to focus everybody on the final copy and details on the best practice in student transitions recommendation to the full OEIB. That's the one that has some color coding beginning with the yellow highlighted K-12 student transitions. At the last meeting, we talked about the idea of the committee members giving me kind of a point to highlight, but because we've reduced this quite a bit and I have 30 minutes to present this, I think it is important to share everything on this document, partly because most of it is already in progress. So it didn't make sense to me to prioritize when things are already in progress. I think it's just our opportunity to acknowledge the work that's going on, say that we think it's important, it is related to a best practice, and that we just want to support the work that's currently going on. So I know that I don't need to read each of these to you today, but what I'd like to do is just take a few minutes and have committee members look at and see if there's anything you want me to particularly call out that's not on the page. Mark. So you can see we have them identified as tasks or policy changes, and then there are some items that we'll call out and say this is work already underway under each of those categories. The K-12 student transitions, the student transitions 11 to 14, the purple label, educator quality, and then digital conversion. You will remember that this document was longer last meeting, and that we took some items off because we felt there was follow-up we would focus on in the coming year, and that will be the next document we go to. So I'm just going to pause for a moment and ask those of you who kind of worked on specializing in a category, would you please look at that and see if there's anything else you want me to add?
I don't know if this is to add as much, Yvonne, but I ran this past our regional superintendents yesterday at our meeting. And the majority of discussion that they were interested in was the diploma by literacy seal. There's question whether that's by literacy or bilingual.
I think it is a bilingual.
I think it is. At least that's what I said. I felt that was more the intent. And
let me double check.
This might be a little bit of semantics, but that...
Well, it matters.
It does.
Could you assess them differently?
Yeah, that came up. So.
Okay. Great point.
We are recommending bilingual seal.
Right.
There was a great deal of interest in this topic. As I went through all of these, this is the one they kept falling back on. Okay. They thought that had a lot of potential to reach out to our kids. You know, we've done quite a bit of work in our region on the Spanish proficiency assessment and looking at language as a strength rather than a weakness. We also discussed some of the proposals coming out about the weights and whatnot with COSA on ELL. Okay. And I think that there's just a lot of synergy, I guess, looking at our ELL population and what we can do outside the box for that in this coming session as a strategic investment. And this seal seemed to be one that was really one that people could hold on to as a concrete example.
I just went back and looked at an email from Tim Blackburn. You may have remembered he came to one of our meetings. He's a staff member in the Oregon Department of Education Equity unit. And they are convening a group, and they are calling this the biliteracy seal. So it seems to me that you all are asking for a follow-up from Tim
Yeah.
that would provide you with very clear information about how is that term being used? I shall follow up and send that even before our next meeting, because I think that's an important distinction.
I think we would also
Make
want to
sure.
ask, how is it being assessed,
Yeah.
right? Because if, it might be in the assessment that helps us get clear about whether they really are talking about bilingual or biliterate.
No, I'd say it's good to know that your superintendents are excited about making some progress on English language learners, because it's something this committee spent some time on in the last year, and I know it's kind of very general recommendation here, but we've talked about some real specifics about the hurdles in entering high school when your English language proficiency is not high enough, and how we're losing students there. And also, it's just come up in the last year how students' progress in English language skills is tracked or really not tracked, and the importance of doing that. So I think there's a lot here in that first recommendation that's very important. I would like to make sure it does get followed up on if it's a priority set by the OEIB.
So you're helping me really look at that section differently. Out of those 4 points we've noted, 3 of them are focused specifically on ELL students. So I think what I'll do is call that out as a theme,
Yeah.
talk about the importance to this committee as well as superintendent groups. And then I think it's powerful to pause and let you two add comments if you'd like to around that to emphasize that.
That'd be great.
And it
Okay.
may also be very helpful to connect this back to the word of transitions. Because I think sometimes
Yeah.
people are forgetting this is another type of transition for students.
And I think in addition to transitions, the other 2 words that I think I'll call out is that what we're looking at about best practices are the things that are needed in order for us to understand the progress they're making, so that we can learn what best practices are effective. And then the other one is, where are we providing opportunities for what they bring to be considered an asset, and then ways to maximize that, right?
Yep. Okay, you want the next piece of feedback
Yes.
from these guys? It was a good conversation.
Yeah.
Okay, the next one on the HEC, and great deal of conversation about developmental education. I was able to share some data that we received at the RAC about where our kids are going and how they're performing once they enter community college. And so the whole issue of the compass testing, AccuPlacer, developmental ed. At the Eastern Promise, our credit by proficiency pathway, there's no compass test required. So we're going to look at the data to see how, without a gate in the way of kids entering a college class in high school, how are they performing against kids who did pass that? We're going to be taking a look at that. So the whole developmental ed piece, we had a lengthy conversation on. We did kind of a data dump looking at it. And then it moved to this and talked about how are we going to look at the smarter, balanced assessment as that assessment. Strong support for us considering that being the assessment that aligns to post-secondary. So nothing here earth-shattering, it's already listed, but what I'm saying is vetting it with 19 superintendents, the whole developmental education / using a common assessment smarter, not over-assessing our seniors, our kids over and over and over. That was a pretty productive theme of just makes sense to streamline.
So when we get to the second point, Mark, once again, I think it'd be important for you to call that out. I think making that point, that'd be great.
Will do. Hopefully more concise.
I think that's okay. We have half an hour and we really have, I mean, look, we've already gotten through the first side of this page. Did somebody, Lynn, did you want to make a comment?
No.
Oh, okay. Anybody else on the phone? Okay. Dave, anything else you want to say about that section 1114?
Well, I can only echo what Mark said, and that's been a lot of talk on the Higher Education Coordinating Commission too, about aligning standards for entering college with those standards completing high school. So I think anything that looks at a better type of placement and entry into high school, and anything that looks at preparing students better to enter college too, makes sense. So I know the HEC's also moving forward on that.
So I'll add that some conversations in my region have kind of escalated and have some heat around the conversation about proficiency.
Mm-hmm.
So as we work through these Eastern Oregon replication grants, that question keeps bumping up against kind of a wall where we have agreement with some, and then we're getting a lot of pushback as we start to work on those components. And I think at some point, this best practice panel ought to take on some kind of, I don't know, definition or expectation about where we stand with proficiency as we look at the whole pipeline. I think it's clear in K-12 that that's an expectation for us, but what doesn't seem to have found its way through all the layers in the higher ed system is whether proficiency really is going to be required, honored,
You
in that
know,
whole piece of work.
and not to digress, because we need to finish this, but I'm agreeing with you, Yvonne, in that I would like this committee over time to be really looking at the data on our strategic initiatives. And it would be nice to break down and spend some time. Let's look at how much we invested in STEM. Where are we with the STEM hubs? How much we invested in the scale up for the Eastern Promise, so where are we? I think, that's one thing that I keep pushing as we move forward with the budget here, is that we've invested heavily last biennium. Some of these we're going to want to continue. Some of these we may want to abandon or fund in a separate manner through the formula. But I'm throwing this question out to you guys. Do you see this subcommittee as the ones to evaluate student performance tied to those strategic initiatives?
Well, I think that we probably have to share that work with the Outcomes and Investments group, because outcomes is part of what they're looking at.
Right.
But we, I think, can help provide, I think about maybe the methodology that's focused around best practice. What should we be looking at and how should we be measuring that? And then providing that to that, maybe that's a good place to have a
I
discussion.
see us
with
as
that
we're the
committee.
instructional group.
Yeah.
Okay, they're the financial/performance. And I'm just thinking about your nuance about proficiency.
Right.
We're the ones to sort that through these strategic investments. So just an idea to throw that out for us to consider, that as we finish this work, monitoring those strategic investments is something in the future I think we should do.
Great. Hilda, you wanted to add something?
So, a couple of things I can add to that discussion point. I work pretty closely with the directors at ODE that have responsibility for the strategic investments that they're monitoring. That does not include Aspire, and there's something else it doesn't include. I can't remember right now, but the majority of them
Well, yeah.
coming through ODE. And there are two things. One is I'd like to have Jonna Timms, I think I have her down here later on the agenda for this year, but maybe have her come in a little earlier and give you an update on the data points that they're collecting on
Right.
each of these, so you know what that is.
Yep.
They're also, of course, going to be providing a very detailed update for the Joint Ways and Means Committee in February. I don't know what date or anything, but they're already preparing for that report. So we could have folks from ODE come and share that with you as well. And then the third thing is I've already built into your agenda for next year, a deeper look for a whole meeting is just looking at specifics. But I think what would be very helpful would be to give some guidance so that, as Yvonne points out, we don't want to know every single detail of something in 32 slides for each strategic investment. So this group might want to spend a little time, if you have it today, to dig in deeper and think about, well, how would you like that information shared? And how can you glean out both two things? One, whether or not it was an efficacious strategic investment, and secondly, what best practices should be drawn from it, and then what's the responsibility for sharing that with others. So I don't know if you'll have enough time today, but it is, I don't want to just say, we want updates.
Right,
Exactly.
no, yeah.
So it's a good time to do that, and in the meantime, I will contact Jonna and see if they're at a point where they're ready to share that. They
So
were
here's-
adding in some columns.
So here's like a concrete example. We're going to look at the Eastern Promise and see, okay, how we doing in each one of these areas. But I'd like professional learning communities we know are a very successful model to boost student achievement. So how are the PLCs doing in all 5 sites? Let's get some data. So that would be a specific example. How are the proficiency assessments? Those are best practice terms that we could be diving down into. But I agree, I don't want just another flyby, longer meeting.
So I think there's 2 parts to that before we go back to this document, as I think back to what I mentioned around proficiency. And one is the best practice component of that, and the other one is there's a political aspect to this, especially when you talk about proficiency and how those are working with regards to the PLCs, and then how kids are getting credit and all of those things. So I think we kind of want to call out some of those, because if we don't take a look at the political aspects, we won't be paying attention to the barriers, you know, to be blunt. There really are barriers here that are political barriers, and we need to at least call them out, even if we can't solve all of them right away. One thing that's occurring to me, I'm remembering the college and career readiness definition we worked on,
Yes.
and taking it to OEIB. Perhaps we need to do the same thing around proficiency that talks about kind of what are the data metrics for proficiency, because there are some different ways people are looking at that. We ought to understand what that looks like, because I know just even at high schools, that's different in different places.
Well, we use it interchangeably, the term.
Yeah, and I think then we have to talk about what is the expectation, and at what levels, and as we look across taking out the barriers around transitions, what are we expecting, and who are the people that have to become accountable to those expectations? It seems to be clear within a system, but it's across the systems where we have those challenges. Okay, so it sounds like a lot that we're pointing to for our future. We're getting back to this document for today. I think it's just helping people understand. We will continue to identify and call out best practice as well as barriers, and offer some solutions as we go forward in the next year. If you turn the page, we're still...
If I can just
Sure.
add 2 things, that conversation, I think just what you kind of got there at the end, I hear a lot of examples used when we use the term proficiency teaching. So it would really help to look at some concrete examples, like something they are doing at the Eastern Promise and maybe in other districts, other states, so we're a bit clearer on the definition of what we mean by proficiency.
And we have some folks that would be able to provide a very good context, both within the state and give you a national picture as well.
It would help to spend some time on that. Another thing, as we're looking at kind of reviewing where we are in strategic initiatives and helping to kind of evaluate how they're doing, it's something in the later meeting this afternoon of the Oregon Education Investment Board. It's something from the Outcomes Investments Committee had a little chart with at least a start of that, with like amount of students served, progress towards completion, something for their initiatives, and that's something we should be looking at for our initiatives too. How many students are served? What's the amount of the investment? How is it improving equity? What's the completion rates? Things like that. I mean, some of it's going to be long term. I think we tend to look in Oregon something just kind of on a level. Oh, it's been in place for 6 months or 12 months.
Right.
And I think we're going to have to approach some of that long term. But we should start laying that groundwork now, and it should be integrated with the OEIB across the board, across the subcommittees. So we're using a some common metrics.
So it's almost aligned with the longitudinal database sort of initiative. In fact, using that kind of approach across our committees to say, what are we going to look at and how are we going to look at it across the committees? That'll make reporting to one another and having joint meetings probably more meaningful. So good suggestion, David. Thank you. All right, so looking at the top of page 2, the back side of the presentation for today, addressing barriers for districts falling short of eligibility for Treo. Again, we're talking still about some of those barriers. Anything else? That there again, the smarter balance in lieu of placement, that's Mark, what you're going to mention actually in one of the ones above, so there'll be a link to that one. Anything else on that 11 to 14 time years transitions? We'll move to educator quality. Just take a moment and take a look at that and see what we want to, if there's anything else we want to call out there. Anything else on that one? All right, let's look at the digital conversion.
This was one that came up, and it was more just the COSA recommendation so that every school district is on high-speed internet. And, you know, this isn't a fancy one that catches a lot of attention, but when you don't have enough fiber out at Doofer, which they actually have quite a bit, a lot of windmill money there.
I think that's quite a quote. When you don't have enough fiber out in Doofer, I think we have to bookmark that for some future.
It's not actually accurate though, because they just got a new building. But anyway, okay, McDermott. If there's enough fiber in McDermott, so. But you know, we don't have all of our schools with the pipe, let alone the servers. And you know, what I see is, give you an example, in our region, we 19 school districts, they purchased over $2 million worth of technology this summer. Okay, Chromebooks, iPads, same things everybody's doing. But you better have enough fiber to handle all that video streaming, to handle ELPA testing at the same time that your kids are in an AP class. And if we don't have that set up, and it isn't a fancy thing that people want to really talk about, it's almost like facilities, but I just, that's what the conversation was yesterday is, and COSA called that out very clearly in the recommendations, and I noticed that's what we said. I just wanted to clarify that fiber McDermott quote there, Lynn.
So actually, I think the way I better talk about that is that there was a set of COSA recommendations and that we sort of tried to streamline what we were bringing forward, because actually that one doesn't show up here, and yet we know that there is some work happening statewide to work on that one. So I think I better put that one back in to say we are recommending that at the state level there's attention to that need for fiber, broadband, not even sure how to talk about
devices.
because this is about just devices.
It
yeah.
does. And, you know, I mean, I don't want to ever beat this to death, but right now when I look at districts, and some of it they're required to do, like ELPA, and how much broadband that takes, and what that does for some schools as far as shutting systems down. Mm-hmm. As they all move to one-to-one digital conversion, it's not just buying Chromebooks, which they're doing now because their budgets are freed up a little bit. It's the infrastructure, and do we have a statewide system where we evaluate what your district has coming in the pipe? You know, our IT staff does do that for our region, but I don't know if that's consistent across the state of Oregon, that everybody has a review on what their needs are. That may be the starting point.
And that was another recommendation that was made to ODE, that ODE sort of put that information together about how you do that kind of review.
And we're asking them to come in October to talk with you all about that.
Okay.
Okay. David, anything?
It's fine. I think it's
Okay.
a good point.
Anybody else on the phone? All right, so that takes care of today's presentation. I will be speaking strictly from this page. I think narrowing things down so we don't have multiple slides, but one document for people to look at enables people to focus, especially when we have so many important areas we're focusing on. So if we look at the next thing on our agenda, and that is really to look at our scope of work, which is the next colorful document. Notice the same color coding, which indicates for us that we're not really changing any direction. Right? So what I heard last time is, and we've already talked about it a little bit today, is one of the key things we need to do is ask in some of the work that we weren't clear enough or didn't think we'd made enough progress to put in the prior presentation to the full OEIB today, that we're asking groups to come back and provide us an update, and we're going to get clearer about what do we think is the recommendation about best practice that we need to help continue to move forward.
So a comment on this, I have begun to reach out to identify appropriate contacts that would be needing to come in and work with you all and share what they're doing. And as you know, it's kind of hard to lay out the whole year's agenda. So as soon as I get one nailed down, then I talk to the next person. They can't do October, but they can do November, you know. So I just want to warn you all that even though I've listed some names on the right, we may move them around a little bit, and I haven't gotten all of them lined up yet. But I think one of the things that we commented on as we reflected, and by the way, Nancy, who's going to be joining you, couldn't get here at 10 today, but her comment was also to make sure that as we talk about something that engages a certain agency, that we make sure that they're there also, so that we're not talking about something that falls within their world of work and they're not there to either listen, engage, take away, add to, whatever.
Or share
Right.
what they're
Right.
really doing.
But sometimes
Okay.
you can have one point person and there's others in the agency that need to be there. So
Right.
we'll be building
Okay.
that agenda.
All right.
A lot of question marks on there.
Yes.
So Hilda's so organized that she's mapped out the year for us, knowing that we'll have to make some shifts. I always say when you're really organized, then you can be flexible, right? Because you know where those spots are.
I'm going to have her schedule my dental appointments.
So I did put in February, since I know that all of the strategic investments data will be at a certain point in time where they'll be sharing them anyway with the legislators. So I put in that the whole meeting in February, we might focus on strategic investments. I also added in Eastern Promise specifically, since that has some connections, and Mark would be able to arrange that. So that's
Yep.
across the board. You may decide you need more time on that, and you may need to carry some of it over to the next meeting in March. I also felt as though the focus around developmental education, placement tests, some of the questions that were raised around the HEC, around student assistance and financial aid. I'm going to talk with Carmen Rubio tomorrow to see whether or not we could arrange maybe a representative from their group to come and join us, maybe not the whole group. And the same thing for the financial work group, to see if they could come in January and meet with us and kind of have that dialogue. There's been some interesting activity recently around the topic. I'm kind of moving up the list here. There have been some interesting updates and discussions around how we're providing the supports and advising systems and building a college-going culture and career-going culture amongst our K-12 kids. And I also am going to probably move that one back to December, because there's a group, the White House has just convened some attention around not retrofitting, but updating the kinds of skills that counselors need to bring to the table. So Jean Akins, who is in charge of the preparation program for guidance counselors at OSU and very involved with their state association, is taking a team from Oregon to a meeting. And so we may move him down to December so that he can come back with the latest insights and their team plan that they're going to develop. Other things here, as I mentioned,
Before you go on to that, could I
Yeah.
just mention one other thing about that? That reminds me, it feels like it's a little bit tied to the one we talked about before about how do you help all teachers create that college going
Right,
and what they need
right.
to know. So it's, while I know it's easy to call out guidance counselors, because that's easy to get our arm around, what we ought to say is, as they develop that curriculum or body of knowledge, how do we ensure that all teachers are getting some access to that and some expectation that that gets woven into what they're teaching?
That's a good addition. And also with that, he would not be the only person that joins us. There's really now an array of groups that are providing some of the advising. I just met with College Possible yesterday. They're doing work where they actually transition. They follow the students that they work with from the junior year of high school all the way through college. That's their commitment. And they're focusing primarily on students who are first gen, second language learners, students from low-income backgrounds. And they're not statewide, but that's just another example of a partner, a community partner that's coming to the table, providing access and support. But this would be a great time to also look at what does Aspire do in this work? How are the AVID programs contributing? And then how do we look across the state to get a more systematic plan that says you may not all use the same providers, but we want to make sure there's some key elements that every student has access to.
It reminds me of the blueprint we did with the ELL collaborative around, there's these main areas you need to pay attention to. And actually, if we could even take the best practices from each of those programs, call them out, and figure out how do you almost do like a rubric around each of the practices, because then districts could plug into what can they do, or partners, or different organizations, but we'd have sort of that template. That'd be a pretty awesome piece that we could offer in terms of best practice.
Other things, I tried to put ODE on early. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to make that one happen next month, but to just start that conversation if they're adding digital conversion staffing and how they're going to be working with the plan. And then the report from the Accelerated Learning Committee to legislators will be due October 1st. So this is a good time for you all to get an update on that. And to also look at this core to college alignment proposal that has been over the summer being vetted with various groups. And that's about how will the SBAC results be used to help students with placement and that transition.
Who's
So-
working on that, Core to College?
Well, it's a grant that the state has. It was originally awarded to CCWD, and Lisa Mintz now, who used to be at the Oregon University system, is serving as the coordinator for that. So she meets with me regularly to provide updates. And in fact, just as a side note, we're getting ready to release some information about the college and career readiness definition for parents. So I may be sending you a draft to look at. She asked for feedback.
Oh, good.
So she's working on both of those projects right now, as well as the writing alignment work that you might have heard about that's happening at post-secondary.
And do you know in other states or universities or colleges looking at aligning their entry test with Smarter
Yes,
Balance?
we're looking specifically, Washington has already looked at a plan, and then there are a number of other states. And so she'll provide that as a backdrop to give you kind of a, here's what the nation is doing, whether
Good.
it's PARC or SBAC.
Are you finished with that column? Because I want to mention something about the earlier one.
Oh, yeah, I just was kind of randomly.
Well, I just thought about something as you two were just having that conversation, and thinking to the documents I read for the full OEIB meeting today, the whole initiative around third grade reading, there may be some things we want to say, what are they learning as ODE is working on it? Because there was a lot around family engagement. Again, if we can help identify what is that best practice and help sort of layer that across all of these initiatives as we learn more, calling out what the best practice is. I was thinking specifically about ELL kids. I don't know how much of that they're taking on specific to ELL, but as I look at the way we've identified our scope of work for the next year, clearly we're going to spend a lot of time on student transitions 11 to 14, but we don't want to take our eye off of our focus around ELL, specifically making progress in that third grade reading piece and being successful all the way through. And then also the early learning piece of that. So those will be the two kind of big nuggets I think we got to keep track of as we talk about best practice and start to highlight the best practice.
Could we ask, Lynn, you may want to help coordinate whether or not you think March is the right month for an update on the early learning initiatives. Obviously, I can work with Megan, but would love your insights also on what you think would be most appropriate for this group to focus on.
I think it would be, I'm thinking about, I think we could do March or sooner. I want to give Megan, who's new in her role, sufficient time to kind of get her feet on the ground. I think she'll have that done by the end of this month. We are working on some kind of common metrics to clarify for the hubs that are established what, to simplify, I guess, would be kind of their performance expectations. So March is certainly great for us, and potentially, if you wanted to do something sooner, we could do that as well, but March is fine.
Thank you, appreciate that. If you flip over to the other side, it's not that I didn't have any ideas or thoughts, it just happened that April turned out to be vacant. And I figured you're going to need something where as things come up through the year, you have a month that you don't have a full agenda. So
Well, I think also, especially as we get through the legislative session and we start to see which of the
There might be
policies
some
are
things
going
that come out of that.
You think so?
You know, also, I look at July 14th, update on strategic investments. You could also do you could slide that up there as kind of a placeholder in April, too. I know it's early for the data, but the conversation I was talking about of just having a review of some of these preliminary, that's
You know,
just
what-
an idea with it being empty.
I like that idea because I think what we could do is ask people to point out what are the best practices that they're sort of looking through.
Yeah.
And then in July, they're coming back and saying, of these best practices, here's what the
I
results look
like that. We could bring in the contact folks for the strategic initiatives we invite and have a conversation on what we'll be looking for, and we're reporting out in July, so we're on the same page.
okay.
And you asked us earlier to identify kind of how would we like those reports. I just like the idea of having those two ideas. What's the best practice and what's the metric? And then getting clear about the timeline. I think Peter Trauma did a great job in his report as he looked at the Achievement Compact and all the data that sometimes the barrier is just all these dates on when we get data, when
Right.
people do reporting and so on. Part of how I think we can help the whole system with the barriers and the ability to measure outcomes is to know early on what are the best practices, what are the metrics, and then what are the timelines around collecting that data, reporting that data, and then when is it most advantageous to sort of call out how you can impact that for the next year. Because we make an assumption that it should all fall around the regular school year or whatever other assumptions we might make, legislative session or so on. And sometimes it doesn't really
Right.
work with the time kids are actually in schools, right?
Exactly.
Or when we have to prepare. You know, an example I use in the school district is if we waited until August and September to be setting goals for that school year, we're really behind the 8 ball because we've already done our budgeting for that year, right? It needs to start way early the next year, and I think the same thing for us. They might be different timelines. So if we look at specifically the best practice, the metric, and timelines for that, I think is a great way to have people report that to us. Does kind of simple, and I think it would work across all of them. And maybe when they identify best practice, I think that they could also be identifying where's the research behind that, and identifying, is there research, or is this an innovative program that's a promising practice? Right? Because then I think we could point to our research arm of ODE and OEIB and HAC and the different places to say, how are we collecting that data as a state and doing research on our own students like we're expecting around the ELL?
So there's a perfect example of that that's underway already. We have the OEIB Research and Policy Unit looking at schools that have high percentages of students of various backgrounds and low-income backgrounds, and yet the school is getting tremendous results. Some of them may have been focused priority schools, and they're now no longer viewed that way. They're model schools. And what they're doing is looking at what the literature says around culturally responsive practices, and then using those to engage with the teachers and the administrators at those sites to figure out which of these best practices from the literature have made a difference for you in how you're turning that school around. So it's very Oregon specific, because right now we can all find lots of lists of these are practices. And what people really are asking for now is what works in a particular environment. It's a heavily migrant community. Is there something specific that we need to think about that works better in this community? Or if it's a very rural community that is serving a lot of families from generational poverty, what are those strategies that are most appropriate?
I think you're spot on, Hilda, that what I'm hearing in the field is they need help with underserved populations, ranging anywhere from cultural competency to best practices, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at your data and look at whose kids we aren't getting it done with. And, you know, the male-female issue, you know, and our students of color. These are things that people are recognizing are issues, but they don't know what to do.
Right.
And so I think if we targeted that.
Well, and there's an interesting point that Yvonne just mentioned around special education. And what we'll probably want to do is to connect with Nicole Meyer with the equity group, because I think several of it, you'll know more today when you hear an update, but I'm hearing that they're going to look at chronic absenteeism. They'll be focusing on overrepresentation of students of color in special ed programs. They may be also looking, I don't know, I just think those are a couple of the areas, and it may be that you want to have Nicole join you for one of the meetings when she can to kind of update you on what they're learning as well, so that we don't duplicate that effort, but that we're enhanced by their work.
Well, and it's such a big area that in addition to what we already have on our plate, if we try to take on all the components around the needs for special ed and getting them into that pipeline, as well as what happens when they're there, I think as we go into smarter balance, we're really going to start to see even sort of more challenges around that.
I agree, and I don't mean to digress, but I just want to put it out there that the more we can move to a pragmatic, hands-on assistance, or at least direct that from ODE. And, you know, you guys know exactly what I'm saying here. I'm looking at superintendents with a high Latino population and high poverty that want to move the bar, who are celebrating the success of the kids they exit.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly we're not getting all of them done. We're not getting our mails through. They would like to know, just almost for hope, is what are some current practices in Oregon? Who are the people who are getting it done? Just give me maybe a contact that I can get on the phone with and call Yvonne at Forest Grove and give me a concrete thing. They don't want to go down the route of class size and all these things. I mean, they've got tag, they've got boy-girl, they've got football programs, all of these things swirling. What I see with them is give me something I can run with. I don't have time to hear all these other elements. I need something to run with and give me a contact that actually will talk to me, or that I can delegate to my building principal or my curriculum folks. And I don't mean to digress here, but I just feel like so many of our conversations here at the 60,000 foot level, and then we look at the data that's about the same, when we know what works at the floor, but people are overwhelmed, how can we sift? How can we sift through things in a more deliberate manner?
So when I think about groups that might be presenting to us, going back to sort of a template, we might, I think under that best practice, in addition to is there research or is this an innovative practice with new promise, I think the third thing we ask is where is it getting done? And where is it getting done for specific groups, which also implies we have to be watching the data to say, where do we see those little places where we're starting to see a trend? Like you said, with males, Latino males, for example. Or the other thing it leads me to is just an example I noticed in my schools where I had a principal who said, you know, we're actually doing a great job with our Latino kids. Where we really have the gap is our special ed kids, and especially our Latino special ed kids, right? And then I looked at the goals of my special ed team. So the school's goals are about reading, math, writing, and getting to graduation if you're talking about the high school level. And the special ed department is about meeting the kids' IEP goals. And in my mind I went, we have a huge disconnect. Because if their goals aren't necessarily pointing to achievement in those areas and ultimately high school graduation and college, then we're not going to get there. Because you've got administrators and teachers pointing to one direction and specialists pointing in another direction, and we're not necessarily meeting. So, for example, in my district, one of the things I'm thinking about doing is beginning to engage in a study like we did around our dual language. We looked at our dual language and said, our kids within the dual language program who have been in it consistently and been able to take advantage of all the supports that program provided, they are succeeding and they are graduating and going on to college. So how do we make sure that we do that with sort of the groups that maybe we haven't lined all those things up?
So there's an example that I'd like to have some data to show you making a difference. Show me some specifics, and is there a contact or a template that I can share, and then let people self-select.
Right.
I mean, I hear Nicole talk about all the success she's had with her program with Native American males. Well, I can tell you our Native American males are about 40%, 50% graduation rate. I would love to hear, tell me concrete examples that we can maybe realign our budgets and have contacts for to start, and conversations to move our board that this is a priority. You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
That's what we are missing so much.
Well, I think there's another piece to that, and that is how are you identifying that? So, for example, I started to use that dual language. We looked at our dual language and said kids are doing well, but we're still not getting the kinds of results the research is showing you could get, right? If you look at an average and you say, well, yeah, we're falling kind of in that average, what if we were at the top end of that? Because when you do an average, some are at the top and some are at the bottom, and we were somewhere between the bottom and the average in most of the schools. And we said, so what if we believed that our schools were going to be at that top, and we went out and found out where those schools are, where the population looks like ours, and we're looking at the specific groups we're talking about, where are they doing it, and concretely, what is it? And we came back with what they called literally a language policy, where they had very clearly articulated pieces, as well as the professional development and who's offering that. And our teachers are energized right now. They're saying, we know what to do. And we really believe we're going to duplicate the results of that school that we actually went to see in Boston. And like you said, sometimes it's the contact and sometimes it's a template. They actually had a template we could find in what they had published about what they were doing. And then we measured it. We went to a few other school districts and we could say, they're not actually doing as well as they say they're doing, and they don't have some of these elements there. So we started to figure out what those elements were we needed to do.
So a venue like the RAC, for instance.
Right.
Iraqs have been very powerful. We get on a video conference and we talk about an issue, then we say, how are you moving your board on that? Are you using your title money for that? Where's a trainer that we could get to come out
Yeah.
here? Are you using a train-the-trainer model? You know how that is in the conversation. At COSA, I went and watched and looked at Clackamas School District's attendance policy for that 9th grade indicator. They have completely owned that 9th grade indicator, 6 credits, 90%. Their attendance program is flawless on what they do as a system, beginning from the teacher and the student contact, that everybody should take a look and see how they've invested and bought in. To me, that's where I would like us to evolve as a best practice, is
So, I wonder-
moving that down.
Yeah, it seems like we need to bring Peter Tromba and his research team and maybe a couple of the folks from OEIB to a conversation early to talk about this so that they can get a sense of what you're really wanting to kind of move towards as best practices. Does that sound like, because if you said those very same things in a way that they could then go, okay, so that helps us define how can we help you get that information in a way that's useful.
Yeah,
Well, this is Lynn, and I just want to support what Mark is saying, and if you can, I have to rearrange my schedule a little bit to get physically to these meetings, so if you could let me know if we schedule Peter, I will make every effort to be there. I think that the kind of dimension here is to the best practices piece is how do you take best practice in an urgent such situation and structure implementation for in that kind of intense setting. And it's really, from a work perspective, it's a different project than a kind of a regular linear implementation. And it's hard to implement best practices in an urgent way, but it is possible and can be done. But it requires different operating assumptions. It requires different, I would say, management structure. And I do think we need to drill down into it, because I think the challenge here is I would call our educational outcomes as urgent right now. And so our implementation can't be what, for example, when you implement something and it's kind of like in the next 2 years we're going to move to this and it will be good best practice, et cetera, et cetera. We have to balance between the urgent and critical need and what I would consider standard implementation parameters for best practices. So I think it's important for us to have a good discussion of that. I have some experience implementing best practices in a large organization in a non-urgent manner, and I also have experience in an urgent manner, and would be happy to work with Peter and Mark to help structure it for the level of urgency that certainly I believe exists.
That would be awesome to do that. It sounds like you have a lot to contribute there, Lynn. It makes me think about sort of jumpstart kindergarten and preschool ideas. How do you jumpstart best practices? And I like the way you kind of described. One is standard implementation, which we know is sort of over time staying the course to very specific deliverables. But what you're talking about is what are those key deliverables that jumpstart and get that more urgent outcome and very explicit about what those are. And I'd love to learn from you and Peter about how we could do that. I'm also thinking it might be helpful to include, I'm forgetting ODE, do they have a research person as well?
Yes, they do. They just hired 2 people who are specifically working on the strategic investments, and I can certainly talk with both Brian Reeder, who is overseeing a lot of that, as well as those 2 individuals. Lynn, how does it sound for me to try to set up a conference call with you and Peter and myself so we could think about how to structure the conversation even, and if you have something that you want folks to read ahead of time, to send that so that we could get that out to the members and also to the research team?
That would be great. I'd love Mark to join the call because, again, my experience is in the not-for-profit sector for social and healthcare services, so the translation to the education environment would be helpful.
Will do.
Great.
And I regret I have to step off the call now, but I will, I'll reconnect with you all as you know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lynn.
David, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think what Mark's brought up is really important, and it shouldn't be understated. It's something we should be mentioning to the OEIB today in our presentation, and it's great to hear. There's these issues are really coming to the fore. People are aware of them, but they're looking for support. I mean, that's always been something the state should be offering. I think we started off a lot collecting data, doing a lot of reporting, and that's kind of been the impression we've made. So
Right.
I think if we can start setting up a system for sharing and implementing best practices, and what you said, Mark, is it's true. It should be coming from the teachers, from the schools, from the people working in the schools, really. I mean, what are they doing? What's working for them? And I think, it's our role to help set up, or with the Department of Education, to set up a network or system that these can be accessed. So I think it's not just somebody from research or something,
Right.
but also somebody from the Education Department that's going to help us implement that.
Well, I'm excited to tell you that Jonna Timms and Sarah Haviland, who just joined ODE, who comes with a background of experience having done such a network in Boston and in other places in the east part of the country, that they are getting ready to launch this very system that you're talking about. So that will be part of the update that Jonna will be bringing you, so we can just tie that all in together. Okay?
So, taking your recommendation for today, after I share kind of what our recommendations are, I will also point the group to what we see as our responsibility in bringing to them next year is this idea of sort of a template for how best practice gets looked at and how we take action on that to meet the urgent need to
I would
improve
almost say it's an
outcomes.
evolution. I mean, this is what I would recommend, is that we evolve. Like I think Dave was very accurate on how we started, what we've done, and there is definitely a place for us to do these charts and to work on the budget and align with the outcomes. That's our job. However, as we move forward, and I feel like when I come to OEIB as a guy lives out in the sticks, when I come here, I start seeing much more about public education than I did when I didn't have that exposure on nonprofits, on other types of pre to 20. And I've been blessed that I've been given this experience to then go back and say, what can I do with my kids? Not everybody has that. Somehow we need to get down into the trenches with concrete examples. We need to evolve into that. So that's what I see it as, Yvonne, is not so much that, we need a dramatic change of pace. It's just, let's get down to what is our role in getting to the teacher.
Right. Yeah, the urgency isn't so much our pace, it's getting clear about what are those things that get outcomes earlier, right?
Yes.
It makes me think about how we talk about equity work. In the state we've done a lot of work around dialogues, and many of us have been frustrated that we keep talking about equity, we keep talking about closing the achievement gap, and we keep talking about race conversations and racism and institutional racism and oppression and white privilege and all of these topics. And we have all these adults ready, but they don't know what to do. And then we just keep talking about ideas. And we've just recently contracted with National Equity Project, who've worked with our administrators. And the new theme for us is really, how do I take what I now know and see, even though I don't know everything, I might even know just a little piece, but how do I take action? And how do we do that together? What are those concrete action pieces? And what we're really discovering is it's about paying attention to that group of kids or an individual kids and saying, using your creativity and everything you know about teaching and learning, and saying, how am I going to take an action right now to change the course of that outcome for that
Okay,
student?
so right there is a perfect example that I would love to have what you've done. That tip, I don't want to keep spending time telling me I have a problem because I know it.
I'll give you the name.
But see, that's what I see our role is we're spending a lot of time identifying a problem when we're preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
We're going to get something done for these kids.
Right.
And so that would be something I can run with, bring back and say, what do you think? And then how does that get involved in the political process with boards and staffs?
I almost hear that you might, I can't believe I'm suggesting kind of a template.
Not another committee.
No. No, but a template that actually we could use and to kind of get the best practices and the findings that are tips for others to use. They come to this group for sort of a review process. The research group brings them forward, whether it be ODE and OEIB, and then they get pushed out.
Beautiful. Just a
But
simple.
kind of something simple.
Yeah,
I'm even talking 2 pagers.
Max, Hilda.
Oh, max.
Not a Hilda chart, okay?
So mean.
I'm talking a page and a, boy, we love you.
Wait a minute. She built this chart that's 2 pages right here. Remember that?
And it is incredible how it was streamlined. It's definitely kudos there. But for instance, yesterday's conversation, I had 2 things that could have taken 3 hours. This document and the research on how we're doing with developmental education. 19 superintendents, community college president. We started talking and talking and talking, and if we believe and we trust in local control, which we better because that's who we are in Oregon, if we trust the leadership can make decisions at a local level, if they have information to support, we need to provide that for them. Because I guarantee you, after that conversation, people are going back to their districts and having completely different thoughts. And if I had a 1-pager every month, here's the research, here's best practices, and you can contact Yvonne for what she's doing with equity, they're going to run with it.
Yeah.
If you don't want all those calls, don't put it on there.
Yep.
So yes, a template.
Okay.
So lastly, just to bring conclusion to that, I am just assuming here for the end of the year, primarily May, possibly June, and then July, that we may be making a final report again to the full OEIB. Is that your
Yeah.
assumption? So I just built in some time there.
Yep.
But you've got more things you can fill in there as the, maybe it's these papers coming back in that you can start reviewing.
As I look at that calendar, just the last thing I'll say about that is it seems like July is always the hard time to get us together. People are trying to get a break in there. So that idea you mentioned of bringing earlier on the strategic investments, so we're really talking about best practices when we have more time earlier in the year, and that maybe what we're sort of doing is finalizing really around June.
All right, so I'm
To
just
have
going
a little
to,
break in July and then sort of gear up again in August.
I'm going to move the June agenda up to May, but still keep the OACTE and TSPC update because they will
Okay.
have made some things happen. And then move July up to June and take off, and August to July and take off August. Does that work?
And are you going to try to find room in that scope of work for some kind of look at proficiency learning?
Yes.
Okay.
And I need to, I'll probably work with some folks to make sure that we get a calendar date that works on that.
Okay,
Maybe
so
March.
one thing you said a little bit differently than I had was moving August into July and getting rid of August. It was July we had a hard
I'm
time
sorry.
having a meeting.
I gotcha, thank you.
But, I mean, if we commit early enough and people can plan vacations and whatever around there, we can have. It's just that I remember now August also ends up being the retreat and we don't end up having a meeting here. We had our time putting that in. So both those months are tough. So it seems like if we can chunk our
June.
work
You may
together
need another
in
meeting in
June.
June.
June?
You may need 2 meetings.
Then we might want to get one on the calendar way early because that's end of school year, retreats with my administrators, and a lot of stuff going on in that month of June. So to put in 2, we better plan early.
Can we dovetail it with COSA?
That would work really well.
That would sure
For
make
us.
Make life easier.
I don't know how that works
I
for
don't know.
David.
I don't know yet.
Okay.
So early.
It's usually that week of June 20th, right around there. So that would maybe work. Okay,
I think it would also, speaking of that, I'm working with the Educator Equity Advisory Group, and we've really been thinking a lot about how do we keep the agenda around what we're trying to accomplish around diversifying our workforce and getting better at retaining high-quality teachers, that I think maybe you need to talk with Craig about putting a session in COSA around what this committee has done for the year. 'Cause
I know
if
we've done
indeed
that
they're
before,
doing
we just
We have to
didn't
do it,
this
say
year,
we'll
yeah.
do it.
Okay,
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, I think so too.
Mark.
Because it's a great way for us to clarify.
I will do that.
And actually, if we have a template for it, it's not a bad idea for us to share that at the January, if we have a template by then.
You know, that's awesome.
Because that's where the superintendents are. When we go in the summer, that seems to be more geared for principals, which is not a bad thing. I mean, we can still report there. But if we want to have a dialogue and be vetting that with all the superintendents, that might be a place for us to get some good feedback on a template.
You know how at Salishan, we have those group meetings and they're just kind of open and that big?
Right.
We could just tell Craig we'd like 5 to get on that.
Yeah.
Nancy and Rob
okay.
Did you say 5?
for 5 minutes.
Oh,
Just roll it out. So when do you think we can get this template done?
I think you need to have a conversation with, you know, I want to bring Peter and Jonna
Right.
and somebody from the ODE research team and Lynn together on a phone call.
Okay.
And then I think we might be able to get that in a rough draft format for you by October.
That'd be
Okay.
great.
So it's very realistic that we would ask Craig to be at the January, to present the template in January.
So you mentioned the 5-minute thing.
Well,
We might want to also have a breakout time when those who are willing to sit down with us and really work through it, even if we only get 5 or 10 superintendents. At least everybody knows about it and we have a space to have that dialogue.
I'll email Craig and CC you.
That'd be great. Thank you for taking that on.
Terrific.
David, were you trying to say something earlier? I can't
No,
remember
no, I
if I
said
gave you
it.
a chance.
I said it.
You did? Okay. I'm sorry. I get excited when we start talking about things that actually might get moved this far on here alone. Okay. You have what you need, Hilda,
I do.
to adjust
do.
the template. We have what we need for today's presentation, and it looks like we do have 3 people for public testimony. We'll start with Tamara Bush Johnson from Business Education Compact.
Should I just up here?
Yes.
Yes. Great, thank you very much. And I really thank you for your earlier comments about proficiency-based teaching and learning. I really think that there is a political reality around those words in the state, and I just think we just need to address, just exactly what are those changes. Because real change is real hard, as we know. And I'm really not here to say anything too much more about it, but to let you know what your investments were. And Mark, if you could give each person one. During the last time and through House Bill 3233 and the network, Quality Teacher Network, you invested modestly into proficiency in the state. And we were able to then select 4 sites with that, 4 demonstration sites around the state, and you can see some of the activities. And there are some measurements where we intend to reach 710 educators and 33,441 students would be impacted through this. And some of the things, Mark, that you were mentioning earlier about really facilitating this collaboration, the sharing of best practices, what have we learned, what's successful, what were the challenges, so that everybody doesn't have to make the same mistake, is going to be included in this particular grant. And so I just, ask that you revisit it. You earlier talked about you invested in something because of the start date of this particular grant. It wasn't started until May, really, when we had the site selected, the end of the school year. I ask that you, again, perhaps add to your recommendations to the full OEIB board that you modestly invest again so that we can add more demonstration sites and continue the evaluation work, because the data will come in too late for you. The data won't be coming in until later.
We have to, I'm sorry, this is testimony.
We'll let her finish.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. So I brought the 2 pieces of information. One's that And then I was just curious because in 2008, there was an Oregon Education Roundtable that studied best practices. And I brought along a copy for each of you of that report. And that report was very curious. I just looked that up yesterday. It would just hit on many of the things that you talked about today. They identified 3 promising practices. Proficiency-based teaching and learning instruction was number 1. The second one was small learning communities, exactly what Mark mentioned earlier this morning. And the third one was credit-based transition for secondary, for students transitioning into secondary education. It was saying we've been talking about these things now since 2008 in the state of Oregon. There are recommendations in that. We know a lot more, and there are some wonderful best practices around the state of Oregon in each of these 3 areas. And that I just encourage you to really be brave and tackle what we already know about best practices and address those in your recommendations. So thank you. Mark, did you have a question?
I was just looking at the high schools and thinking about our participation with this, that we might want to look at this in the future with the link to 1114.
Yeah, I wrote a note to myself, especially as we consider the proficiency work we want to do around the definition and some maybe recommendations, expectations across the levels. It seems like we ought to engage with that. I wrote a note to myself to make sure we do that as well. Thank you very much for that testimony and for the information. And next we have Dr. Dapple. Please join us here.
I don't see now my feet and my brain. I don't know how they go together. I don't know. You did a good job this morning. I don't know whether it's you as the chair or we, the audience. Maybe we make you comfortable. You deliver a good message this morning. Very serious. Very serious, very congenial. But then you talk about that. How do we get here? Not how did we get here, but how do we get here? We always know how to diagnose the problem. We see, because we see it. Some of you have children at home. I do. I see it. Then the man upstairs led me into being part of the problem, seeing it. Then because every time I read all the documentation, they talk about it so well written, well stipulated, well diagnosed. But how do we do it? How come we're not doing it? We don't know how to implement this stuff. Very quickly, I'm thinking of a teacher this morning, 15 pre-K kids, 20 of them. Only 15 know something. The 20, they are outside the whole place. They don't know anything. They didn't come with anything. What do you expect from that teacher? Where's the principal? Everybody in that building. Because that's what you're talking about. How are we going to do it? Then the group that I represent, some of you have heard me saying that before. You don't know how to deal with them. And then they grow up to be what maybe we didn't expect them to be that way. I don't know, because I'm not that part of conspiracy that say, okay, some group want them to be that way. I'm not there. I don't go there. But I know something is wrong, because that's what I do. Because for me, everything started by going to the prison to see them there. The large number of these kids, and I know now, I begin to see where they started from, how they get there. So how? Who is intervening? Who is doing something while they're going? Because it's a journey. Life is a journey. Somebody was there. Somebody corrected somebody this way, that way. School is part of that too. School is part of it. Education is part of it. We've got to get them educated. How are we going to do it? we're going to start talking about how we're going to do it. Then comes, it's not a quick fix. You can't do it. We are human beings. There is no quick fix. But we have to be solid, be congenial, be reasonable, be together.
Thank you, Dr.
Together. Is that all right? Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And our third one is Dick Darst.
Won't take much of your time. I'm uncomfortable coming up and
You have
sitting
3
right in
minutes.
front. Huh?
You have 3 minutes.
Oh, 3 minutes. Good. That's good. I won't need even 3 minutes. I just wanted to call your attention. When I sat and listened to your dialogue today, I thought so many things resonate with what we do in accreditation. You know, we accredit schools in both of your districts. We've got, in fact, our board members.
Can you identify
Dick
yourself
Darst from
and your
Advanced-
role?
Sorry.
Sorry.
Dick Darst, State Director for Advanced Ed, Northwest Accreditation Commission. We have board members on our board that come from your districts. John, for example, Ralph Brown, Jerry Peacock from yours, Mark. And we're doing the exact same things that you guys talk about all the time and directions you want to go. I just want to talk about 2 things that I hope you'll think about. Mark, you talk about seeing best practices in action and what's going on there. That's what our team, multi-administrators every 5 years in a district looking at 70 to 80 schools of the 400 schools that we accredit in Oregon, that's what we're looking at. We call them promising practices, and that we identify them. We have a list of them, and we, to a certain extent, will share that with outside folks, but we keep the overall information about an accreditation visit pretty confidential. However, we're happy to have anybody from any district on our visitation teams. We're constantly recruiting people. The team members are made up of almost exclusively administrators. Occasionally we'll have a TASA or something like that on. But otherwise, they're superintendents and principals and directors of curriculum that are doing those visits. So be thinking about that. That's an opportunity that exists right here in Oregon. The other thing is that I'm sure you may not be aware of, I suspect John hasn't even talked with you, Yvonne, about this, is through Advanced Ed, we can staff team members any place in the United States in districts that do district accreditation. That's a pretty intense visit. It's a 3-day visit rather than ours in Oregon, which is a 1-day plus visit. And that's when a whole district is looked at. So if you say, I want to look at Dade County, Florida, and see what they're doing for migrant kids or low income or any of these groups that we're looking at, you just have to let us know. We'll get you on a team. We have 2 superintendents this year that are doing systems visits, and I think they'll find it incredibly valuable. Will cost your district nothing. It's all paid for through Advanced Ed, mostly by the districts that are being accredited and led by highly, highly trained people. And you go as a team member, you spend 3 days looking in depth at what they're doing and exit with whatever information you want to. So that's all I have to say, but we're more than willing to answer any questions anytime that you have questions that come up.
Thank you very much
Yeah.
for that invitation.
Thanks.
That is an untapped resource.
I was just thinking about that, especially as we talk about best practices and we're looking at, I was thinking specifically about the piece that we were talking about earlier, David, that you brought up, and that is slipping my mind, but it was around our kids. How are we really preparing kids for that next step? So if they can help us identify what they're seeing in terms of where are some of those places where the data is showing that preparation of really getting kids ready for high school, specifically the groups that we're saying we haven't yet taken enough action on as
For high school or for post-secondary?
well, I'm talking about high school right now because high school accreditation is what they do. But if there is a way for them to help us point to what is that best practice they're seeing, where is that happening in our state? Because I know those visits are happening everywhere, and that's an untapped piece of data that we haven't even really looked
Well, when
at.
you think about it too, everything comes down to leadership, and the value add of those visits is leadership. I mean, getting exposure to that in a systemic way, it's powerful. It's a PLC is what it is.
I'm trying to remember which group you guys were talking about in the 11 to 14 years that's really looking at that piece you talked about really ready for college. And if the smarter balance and the assessments and all those things are, when we were talking about placements.
Yeah, just aligning standards and
Yeah.
between the courses. So if you're coming out of high school, you're directly going into college, and by passing the smarter balance, for example, means you're qualified for college.
So it seems like there's a crossover in the conversation somewhere around schools that are doing doing proficiency, and then looking at those standards around best practice, and then that conversation about placement and are they really ready. If there's some information we could get through the work that you all do with accreditation, I think that's definitely an untapped resource. Not sure where to put it yet, but we can think about that. Thank you. All right. If there's not any more comments by the committee, I will adjourn us at 11:20, I believe it says. And we will come back for the best practice meeting. For OEIB. I mean, OEIB meeting.